Bruce Reynolds, Ronnie Biggs, and Charlie Wilson, three names that would go down in history as the masterminds behind Britain's most daring heist. In the dead of night on August 8, 1963, they led a team of criminals in stopping a Royal Mail train, escaping with $2.6 million, a fortune beyond their wildest dreams. But as police launched the largest manhunt the country had ever seen, cracks began to form, paranoia set in, and one by one the gang's perfect crimes started to fall apart. This is the story of the Great Train Robbery, a tale of ambition, betrayal, and a desperate fight to stay ahead of the law. The summer of 1963 was unlike any other for a select group of men who had spent years operating in the shadows of Britain's criminal underworld. They were not ordinary thieves, nor were they reckless opportunists. They were masterminds, planners, strategists, and professionals who understood that the biggest rewards came to those who dared to take the greatest risks. And now, they had set their sights on something extraordinary: a Royal Mail train running from Glasgow to London, carrying an unimaginable fortune in used banknotes. For months they studied everything about the train, its schedule, its security measures, and its vulnerabilities. This was no ordinary operation. Precision was key. Unlike smash-and-grab robberies or high-stakes burglaries, this heist required careful coordination. A mistake could mean capture. A moment's hesitation could lead to failure. They had to get everything right the first time. The plan began with information from an inside source. Someone with knowledge of the Royal Mail's cash transport system revealed that on certain days, one particular train carried large amounts of old banknotes, money, no longer in active circulation, being transferred for disposal. These notes, though destined for destruction, were still completely valid. The perfect target. The gang assembled a team of skilled criminals, each bringing a specific talent to the operation. Some were experienced getaway drivers, capable of vanishing into the night without leaving a trace. Others were experts in disabling alarm systems and handling security personnel. One man, a former train conductor, possessed the technical knowledge required to bring a massive locomotive to a halt and manipulate it as needed. Every member of the team had a role, and every role was critical. The next step was finding the ideal location to stop the train. After scouting several possibilities, they selected a remote stretch of railway near Bridego Bridge in Buckinghamshire. It was the perfect spot. Far from towns, out of sight of prying eyes, and difficult for authorities to access quickly. The plan was to tamper with the railway's signal system, forcing the train to stop exactly where they needed it. Once halted, the crew would be overwhelmed before they had a chance to react. The gang conducted multiple rehearsals. They tested their methods, memorized their escape routes, and drilled every aspect of the plan until there was no room for error. They acquired police radio scanners to monitor emergency responses and ensured that no one in the team could be identified. Masks would conceal their faces, gloves would prevent fingerprints, and a strict code of silence would protect their identities. But even the most meticulous plans carried risks. There was always the chance of something going wrong: an unexpected passenger, an uncooperative crew member, or worse, a police patrol in the wrong place at the wrong time. To minimize these dangers, the gang built several contingencies into their operation. If the train did not stop as expected, they had backup strategies to bring it to a halt manually. If someone resisted, they would use force, though they had agreed to avoid lethal violence at all costs. Once the money was in their hands, the challenge would be getting away undetected. Speed was essential, but so was discretion. The gang secured multiple getaway vehicles, each positioned at key points along their escape route. They arranged for a secluded farmhouse, Leatherslade Farm, to serve as their initial hideout, where they would lay low before dispersing. There, they would divide the money, destroy any incriminating evidence, and ensure that none of them were linked to the crime. As the final days before the heist approached, tension ran high. This was no ordinary robbery. It was a crime that would go down in history. If they succeeded, they would vanish into the world as rich men, leaving behind nothing but questions and speculation. If they failed, they would face justice for one of the most audacious crimes ever attempted. With everything in place, there was no turning back. The date was set, the pieces were moving, and soon, Britain would wake up to news of a robbery unlike anything it had ever seen. The night of August 8, 1963 was still and quiet, with only the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves breaking the silence. The gang, dressed in dark clothing and operating under the cover of darkness, moved with the kind of precision that could only come from months of meticulous planning. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the night that would define the rest of their lives. There was no room for nerves now, only action. As the Glasgow to London Royal Mail train approached the chosen location near Bridigo Bridge in Buckinghamshire, the gang sprang into position. Their first task was to bring the train to a stop without arousing suspicion. To do this, they had already tampered with the railway's signaling system, switching one of the green lights to red. As expected, when the train's driver Jack Mills saw the red light ahead, he instinctively slowed the locomotive and brought it to a halt, following strict railway safety protocols. The next phase of the plan had to be executed swiftly. A small group of masked men rushed forward, heading straight for the driver's cabin. Mills, confused and wary, had little time to react before he was confronted by the intruders. Though no guns were used in the operation, force was applied when necessary. Mills was struck over the head with an iron bar, rendering him dazed and unable to resist. With the driver incapacitated, the gang now had control of the train. However, an unexpected complication arose. One of the men, despite being briefed extensively on how to operate the train, found himself struggling with the controls. The locomotive was not as easy to maneuver as they had anticipated. For a brief moment, panic set in. If they couldn't move the train as planned, the entire heist could collapse, leaving them stranded in the middle of the railway with no way to escape. Thinking quickly, they forced Mills, despite his injury, to operate the train just enough to detach the high-value package, HVP coach, from the rest of the carriages and move it a short distance forward. This coach was their target, the one carrying the bags of money. Now, with the train positioned exactly where they wanted, they were ready for the main event. Inside the HVP coach, postal workers had been handling the vast sums of cash, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding outside. But when the doors burst open and masked figures stormed in, the reality of the situation became clear. The workers were outnumbered and overpowered within moments. They were ordered to lie on the floor and remain still. No unnecessary violence was used. The gang had agreed beforehand that there would be no killings, no reckless harm, only control and efficiency. With the coach under their command, the criminals formed a human chain, moving the heavy sacks of cash from the train to their waiting vehicles. Each bag was filled with banknotes in various denominations, and as the piles grew, so did the realization of just how much money they were stealing. They worked at breakneck speed, knowing that time was their enemy. Even though they had chosen an isolated location, there was always the risk of discovery. Every second wasted increased the chances of someone stumbling upon the scene or a passing train crew noticing something suspicious. Despite the pressure, their coordination was near flawless. The gang members moved like clockwork, ensuring that no sack was left behind. In under 30 minutes, they had loaded 120 bags of cash, totaling $2.6 million, a staggering sum that no British robbery had ever come close to matching. Before disappearing into the night, the gang took a final precaution. They cut communication lines near the railway to delay any reports of the crime reaching authorities. With no way for the postal workers to immediately alert the outside world, they had bought themselves valuable extra minutes. As they sped away in their carefully planned escape vehicles, the adrenaline coursing through their veins was undeniable. They had done it. They had pulled off one of the most daring heists in history. The plan had worked almost perfectly. But what they didn't know was that despite their careful preparations, mistakes had already been made. Clues had been left behind, and the greatest challenge of all was still ahead, evading the relentless pursuit of the law. The gang drove away from the crime scene under the cover of darkness, their vehicles packed with the stolen $2.6 million. Their destination was a secluded farmhouse called Leatherslade Farm, chosen for its remote location and suitability as a temporary hideout. As they traveled through the quiet roads of Buckinghamshire, excitement filled the air. The hardest part was over, and the money was finally in their hands. When they arrived at the farmhouse, the men unloaded the heavy sacks of cash and spread them across the wooden floors. The sheer volume of the loot was staggering. Banknotes of all denominations lay before them, a fortune beyond anything they had ever dreamed of. There was no doubt they had successfully pulled off one of the most audacious robberies in British history. Despite their success, they knew that their work wasn't finished. The money needed to be counted, sorted, and divided. Most importantly, they had to remain out of sight until the immediate police response died down. The plan was to stay at the farmhouse for a few days, allowing the search efforts to settle, before they split up and went their separate ways. At first, the atmosphere was celebratory. The gang had achieved something few criminals ever dared to attempt. They played cards, laughed about the flawless execution of the heist, and even passed the time playing Monopoly, using real money from the stolen haul instead of the game's paper notes. But as the hours turned to days, tensions began to rise. The longer they stayed at the farmhouse, the more uneasy some of them became. The robbery had gone perfectly, but their continued presence in one place increased the risk of discovery. Some of the men argued that they should leave immediately, fearing that the police were closing in. Others insisted that abandoning the safe house too soon would only draw suspicion. If they started making reckless moves, they might attract attention, leading the authorities straight to them. Paranoia began creeping in. Every passing car, every sound outside, every mention of the robbery on the radio made them more anxious. The sheer amount of money they had stolen also created problems. Dividing such a massive sum fairly was no easy task. Some members felt entitled to a larger share due to their role in the operation, while others believed the money should be split evenly. Disagreements turned into heated arguments, and trust within the group began to fracture. Meanwhile, outside, the farmhouse, the largest police investigation in British history, was underway. The authorities, stunned by the scale and precision of the heist, launched a nationwide manhunt. They interviewed known criminals, analyzed potential leads, and scoured the countryside for any trace of the robbers. While the gang had left no fingerprints at the crime scene itself, the pressure was mounting, and any mistake could lead to their downfall. The first major slip-up came from the very place they thought was their sanctuary. While most of the gang had been careful about leaving behind evidence, small details had been overlooked. Unwashed dishes, fingerprints on furniture, and discarded food wrappers, all signs that people had been living in the farmhouse, were left behind in their haste. Worse still, one of the gang members had a careless moment that would later prove disastrous. The Monopoly game they had played with real money was left on a table, untouched, when they finally decided to leave the farmhouse. What had been a moment of amusement would soon become a key piece of evidence linking them to the crime. As the police intensified their search, it became clear that staying at Leatherslade Farm any longer was a risk they couldn't afford. One by one, they packed up and disappeared, each member heading in a different direction. Some planned to leave the country, while others chose to lay low in safe houses across the UK. They had successfully pulled off the robbery of the century, but the walls were closing in. The greatest test of their plan was not stealing the money, it was getting away with it. And as the police pieced together their movements, it was only a matter of time before the first arrest was made. The police discovered Leatherslade Farm just days after the gang abandoned it. A tip-off from a suspicious local had led investigators to the quiet property, where they immediately noticed signs of recent occupation. The farmhouse, meant to be a temporary hideout, was now the most critical piece of evidence against the robbers. As officers searched the premises, they found unmistakable proof of the gang's presence. Dirty dishes were piled in the sink, empty food tins littered the kitchen, and sleeping arrangements had been hastily abandoned. But the most damning evidence was the fingerprints. Despite their careful planning, several gang members had left prints on cups, tables, and other surfaces. When these were sent for analysis, they matched known criminals with records for previous thefts and robberies. The discovery of the Monopoly board, where real stolen cash had been used in place of game money, added to the intrigue. Investigators took it as a sign of the gang's arrogance, playing with their fortune as if it were all a game. This piece of evidence would later become infamous, symbolizing both the success and carelessness of the operation. Meanwhile, the police were already closing in on the suspects. The gang had dispersed, each man attempting to vanish in different directions. Some had fled to London, while others sought refuge in the countryside. A few planned to leave the country entirely, believing they could escape justice by starting new lives abroad. But the scale of the investigation was unprecedented. Roadblocks were set up, and airports were closely monitored. The police interrogated known associates of the gang, hoping to uncover their hiding places. Newspapers splashed the details of the robbery across their front pages, turning the criminals into celebrities overnight. The more their names and faces appeared in the media, the harder it became for them to stay hidden. The first arrests came swiftly. Charles Wilson, one of the key organizers, was caught in his London home having failed to escape in time. He was found with a substantial amount of cash, linking him directly to the robbery. Shortly after, police tracked down Gordon Goody and Bob Welch, two more members of the crew, using leads gathered from surveillance and informants. Some of the gang members had been more cautious, changing their appearances and identities to evade capture. Yet, one by one, they were found. Brian Field, the gang's legal advisor who had helped secure Leatherslade Farm, was arrested after inconsistencies in his story led police to suspect his involvement. The mastermind himself, Bruce Reynolds, managed to evade capture for years, fleeing to Mexico and later Canada before finally being caught in 1968. One of the most dramatic arrests was that of Ronnie Biggs. Initially sentenced to 30 years in prison, Biggs managed to escape from Wandsworth Prison after just 15 months. His escape became legendary. He climbed over the prison wall, jumped into a waiting vehicle, and eventually made his way to France, where he underwent plastic surgery to change his appearance. From there, he traveled to Australia before settling in Brazil, successfully avoiding extradition for decades. Despite the arrests, a significant portion of the stolen money was never recovered. Some of it had already been spent, while large amounts were hidden or laundered through criminal networks. The authorities suspected that much of the cash had been smuggled out of the country, but without concrete leads, they could do little to retrieve it. As the years passed, the gang's downfall became just as famous as their heist. While some served their sentences and eventually disappeared into obscurity, others remained infamous figures in Britain's criminal history. The police had won the battle, but the mystery of what happened to much of the stolen fortune remained unsolved. The robbery had been meticulously planned and brilliantly executed, but in the end, a few careless mistakes had been their undoing. The fingerprints, the abandoned hideout, and the rising paranoia within the group had all contributed to their downfall. The perfect crime had come close to success, but in the world of crime, perfection rarely lasts. The trial of the Great Train Robbers became one of the most talked about court cases in British history. The sheer scale of the crime, the vast amount of money stolen, and the meticulous planning behind the heist had captivated the nation. Now, the men responsible were facing justice, and the world was eager to see how it would unfold. As the accused were brought before the court in 1964, the prosecution presented an overwhelming amount of evidence. The discovery of Leatherslade Farm had been the key to dismantling the gang's carefully laid plans. Fingerprints taken from cups, furniture, and even the Monopoly board directly linked several men to the crime. Additionally, large sums of stolen banknotes were recovered from the homes of some gang members, further sealing their fate. The trial lasted weeks, with each defendant attempting to minimize their role in the heist. Some claimed they had only been involved in the planning, while others insisted they were simply hired for minor tasks. But the judge and jury were unmoved by these arguments. The scale of the crime demanded severe punishment, and the authorities were determined to make an example of those involved. In the end, most of the gang members received harsh sentences. Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind behind the robbery, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Charles Wilson, Gordon Goody, and several others also received similar sentences, ensuring they would spend decades behind bars. But it was Ronnie Biggs's sentencing that became one of the most infamous moments of the case. Biggs, a relatively minor player in the heist, was given 30 years, one of the harshest sentences of all. He would not serve it in full. In 1965, just 15 months into his sentence, Biggs executed one of Britain's most daring prison escapes. With the help of accomplices, he scaled the walls of Wandsworth Prison, jumped into a waiting van, and disappeared. His escape humiliated the British authorities and turned him into a legendary fugitive. Biggs traveled across Europe, using fake passports and disguises to evade capture. He eventually underwent plastic surgery in Paris before making his way to Australia. From there, he fled to Brazil, where he took advantage of the country's lack of extradition agreements with Britain. While living in Rio de Janeiro, Biggs became a celebrity fugitive, giving interviews and even appearing in music videos. For decades, British authorities tried to bring him back to face justice, but legal loopholes and Brazil's refusal to extradite him kept him safe. It wasn't until 2001, when Biggs voluntarily returned to Britain due to failing health, that he was finally arrested and sent back to prison. He was eventually released on compassionate grounds in 2009 and lived out his final years as a free man. Meanwhile, other members of the gang faced different fates. Some served their time and quietly reintegrated into society, vanishing from the public eye. Others struggled to adjust to life after prison. Charlie Wilson, after escaping from jail in 1965 and living as a fugitive in Canada, was eventually recaptured and served the remainder of his sentence. Later, in 1990, he was assassinated at his home in Spain under mysterious circumstances, likely connected to organized crime. Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind, remained on the run for 5 years before being caught in 1968. After serving his sentence, he lived a relatively quiet life, occasionally giving interviews about the heist. He later admitted that while the robbery had been a spectacular achievement, the consequences were not worth it. Despite the arrests and lengthy sentences, one major mystery remained unsolved. What happened to the missing money? Out of the 2.6 million stolen, only a fraction was ever recovered. The rest had disappeared, likely laundered through criminal networks or hidden in secret caches. Some believed that portions of the money had been smuggled abroad, while others speculated that it had been quietly reinvested into the underworld, funding further criminal activities. The Great Train Robbery became a defining moment in British crime history. It exposed weaknesses in the country's security systems, forcing banks and postal services to rethink how they transported large sums of money. It also demonstrated that even the most brilliantly executed crimes could unravel due to simple mistakes, fingerprints left behind, an abandoned hideout, and the unavoidable tensions that arose among the criminals themselves. Over time, the robbery took on a legendary status. Books were written, films and documentaries were made, and the names of the gang members became infamous. Some saw them as reckless criminals who got what they deserved, while others romanticized their story, portraying them as clever outlaws who had outwitted the system, if only for a while. In the end, the Great Train Robbery was a cautionary tale. It proved that no crime, no matter how well planned, was truly perfect.